If you're a photographer, don't buy a stabilized lens until you watch this video, because I will give you some arguments and you could save some real money. Many people think that a stabilized shot equals with a sharp subject in the frame. And this is true, but only in specific cases. For example, if you want to shoot a subject that's far away from you, and you use a 100 or a 400 millimeter telephoto lens, you will encounter two variables. Number one, the shakiness of your hands, and number two, the movement of the subject in the frame. So let's say you want to photograph people, animals, or cars which are constantly moving in the frame. And in this case, the stabilized lens will only help you to avoid the shakiness of your hands. That's it. Your body, together with the stabilization from your lens, will act almost like a tripod and nothing more. So what do you do in this case to have a sharp subject in the frame? Because a stabilized lens or even a stabilized sensor in your camera is helping you to maintain the image on the sensor more stable and get rid of the shakiness. But it will not help you with the subject's motion blur. And to solve this issue, you need to raise the value of the shutter speed. Even if you shoot, for example, at 50 millimeters and you want to capture a person that is walking or running in front of you, you will still need to raise the shutter speed in order to capture the subject without any motion blur and freeze the shot to obtain a sharp photo. Of course, if the motion blur is intentional and you want to have a final photo that creates the feeling of movement and motion, that's perfectly fine, because this is actually a type of photography. Now, if money isn't a problem for you and you want to invest in a stabilized lens because you never know what you need to photograph, that's great and go for it. But just keep in mind that not always a stabilized lens equals a sharp photo. Like I said, you need to adjust the shutter speed. But the question is, what values should you use for the shutter speed? Look, I want to help you even more, so let's dig deeper when speaking about the shutter speed. Just bear with me because I can give you some important tips. Let's say you shoot landscapes, objects, portrait sessions, or you take a photo of your dog while he's staying still or sleeping. Do you need a stabilized lens in this case? Well, it could help you a lot if you're shooting in a low light situation, because if you shoot at 50 millimeters, for example, with stabilization, you can get away with a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second, for example, or even lower than that. And why is this important? Well, because you can keep your ISO at lower values, and this means less noise on your images, which is great especially if you shoot in the evenings, in a dark room, or if you want to upload your photos to stock agencies. What if you want to shoot the same subject with a non-stabilized lens? Well, in this case, you will need to shoot at a higher shutter speed, and this depends if you have a full frame camera or a crop sensor camera. Let's say you have a full frame camera. This means that if you mount a 50 millimeter lens on the camera, you will shoot at 50 millimeters. In this case, when taking photos handheld, it's definitely crucial to have a minimum shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. But if you want to make sure that the subject you're shooting will be sharp in the photo, I recommend you to shoot at a shutter speed which is double of your zoom value. So 50 millimeters multiplied by 2 equals a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second if you're shooting non-moving subjects. And this setting will make your shot stable in your hands. The situation is different, however, when you're shooting with a crop sensor camera. I use Canon, so if you have a crop camera, like the Canon 90D for example, you'll have a 1.6 crop. What this means is that when you put a 50 millimeter lens on it, you'll have to multiply it by 1.6, which gives you an 80 millimeter lens. And in this case, when shooting non-moving subjects, your minimum shutter speed should be at least 1/80th of a second. But I recommend you that you multiply it by 2 and you'll end up with a 1/160th of a second shutter speed. So when taking photos of non-moving subjects, having a lens with image stabilization will help you very much. But if you don't have the money for it, just put the camera on a tripod and you can use slower shutter speeds, lower ISO values, so higher quality photos, technically speaking. Now, if you shoot sports, for example, I personally don't feel like you should invest in a stabilized lens. And that's because people or objects move very fast while doing sports. And in order to have sharp photos, you'll need to crank up the shutter speed anyways to 1/800 or 1/1000 of a second, or even more in certain situations. So with the shutter speed that high, your photos will be sharp enough. That's my opinion. And if you don't agree, that's fine, but please explain why in the comments. I mean, you don't need IS in these cases. There are many variables that you need to analyze before buying a stabilized lens because, for example, a non-stabilized version will cost you far less than a stabilized one. And you could use those hundreds of dollars on other things that you really need as a photographer. But hey, again, if you have the money, go with the IS version because it's worth it. You'll never know what projects will you have if you need to shoot landscapes, action, portraits, and so on. And one good example of a non-stabilized lens is this one, the Canon RF 50mm f1.2. I talk about the pros and the cons of this lens, so watch this video right now and see you there.